Dylan Steele had always been the kind of man who played it safe. A successful millionaire with a life others could only dream of. A world of lavish parties, expensive cars, and private jets. He was a man who thrived on control, carefully curated decisions, and a life that others envied. But one night, standing in the midst of a crowded bar in a small town, that control was about to slip away. The dare had come from his best friend, Adam. It was meant to be a joke, something to liven up the evening and get Dylan to step outside of his meticulously controlled life. "Go on, man," Adam grinned, nudging Dylan with his elbow. "Bet you wouldn't do it. Dare you to marry the next person who walks into this place, just like that." Dylan, his mind already swimming with the options of fine wine and rare cigars, laughed it off. But Adam, always the instigator, wasn't giving up. "I'm serious, Steele. Marry the next woman who walks through that door, and I'll pay for your yacht's maintenance for a year. You know how much that costs." Dylan leaned back in his chair, his hand swirling the glass of whiskey in front of him. He wasn't one for making rash decisions, especially when it came to something as serious as marriage. But in that moment, a strange wave of rebellion washed over him. Maybe it was the years of playing by the rules. Maybe it was the need to prove to Adam, or even to himself, that he could break free. Whatever it was, it had him nodding. "Fine, but if she's a disaster, you're the one paying for my therapy sessions," Dylan chuckled, trying to mask the knot of nerves beginning to twist in his stomach. Adam's eyes lit up, and the challenge was on. They sat back, waiting for the next woman to walk into the bar. Dylan's mind raced, but he quickly dismissed any serious thoughts. He had money, he had power. Marriage wasn't something that could be thrown around like a game of chance. It had to be real, didn't it? The door opened, and in she walked. He noticed her immediately, a woman unlike anyone he had seen before. She wasn't in a dress or heels like most of the women Dylan was used to. She wore a simple McDonald's uniform, her hair tied back in a ponytail. Her eyes, though, were something else. Intense, focused, almost as if she was carrying a story she wasn't sharing with anyone. Dylan's breath caught in his throat, and for a moment, the noise of the bar faded into the background. There was something about her that pulled him in, something raw and real, not like the polished women who constantly surrounded him in his world. She was different. He found himself standing up without thinking. Adam raised an eyebrow, but Dylan barely noticed. He walked over to her, his legs feeling heavy despite his confident stride. "Excuse me," he said, his voice smoother than he expected. "I know this is going to sound odd, but would you marry me?" Her eyes narrowed, her brow furrowing in confusion. "What?" She laughed, though it was a bit forced. "Are you serious?" "Absolutely," Dylan said, holding up his hand. "It's part of a dare, but I'm serious. Marry me." The woman looked him up and down, as if she was trying to decide whether he was joking. A soft chuckle escaped her lips, but there was something behind it, something almost resigned. "I'm Rachel," she said, her voice low and cautious. "And I think you might be out of your mind." Dylan felt a rush of adrenaline. "I might be, but this is the deal. A quick ceremony, you get a generous payout. And I get to say I did something unpredictable for once." She tilted her head. "And if I say no, then you'll miss out on the fun," Dylan said with a grin. "But I think you'll find it interesting." Rachel studied him for a moment, her eyes scanning his face, as if she was looking for something, perhaps honesty or a flicker of doubt. "What do you think this is going to prove?" she asked, stepping closer to him. "Honestly, I don't know. But I do know I'm tired of doing things the same way every single day." He paused, his heart pounding in his chest. "Maybe I'm just tired of the perfect world I've built around me." For a second, Rachel seemed to soften. There was a moment of silence between them before she spoke again. "All right, let's say I agree to this crazy idea," she said, raising an eyebrow. "What's in it for me?" Dylan's lips curled into a smile. A generous sum of money. Plus, you'll be able to say you married a millionaire, if only for a night. She looked at him for another long moment, and then, without another word, she nodded. Okay, let's do it. Dylan couldn't believe what was happening. 1 minute he was sitting comfortably in a bar, and the next he was about to marry a complete stranger. But as he took Rachel's hand and led her toward the makeshift altar Adam had set up, he felt a strange sense of exhilaration. The ceremony was simple, a quick exchange of vows that hardly seemed real. Rachel was cool and collected, her expression unreadable as she looked at Dylan with an intensity that made him feel like he was the one on trial. When the officiant said, "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Dylan's heart skipped a beat. He couldn't believe it. He had just married a woman he knew nothing about, on a dare. But as the words echoed in his mind, one thing became clear. This was only the beginning of something far more complicated than he could have imagined. The next morning, Dylan woke up with a sense of dread. What had he done? What kind of mess had he gotten himself into? But when he turned to look at Rachel, lying next to him, her eyes open and looking directly at him, a strange sense of calm washed over him. "Good morning," she said softly, her voice still tinged with the same mystery he had noticed the night before. Dylan opened his mouth to speak, but stopped himself. He had a million questions. Who was this woman? Why had she agreed to marry him? And what was the real reason behind her quiet, intense demeanor? But as Rachel sat up and stretched, Dylan's mind began to race. What had started as a silly dare was now a reality. And as the morning light filled the room, he realized this story wasn't going to be as simple as it seemed. The morning after the whirlwind marriage, Dylan Steele woke up to a room bathed in soft sunlight. His head ached slightly from the alcohol, and the events of the previous night seemed surreal, as though he had stepped into a different life. He was used to control, to making decisions that were deliberate and calculated. But this was a spontaneous act of rebellion, a dare that had escalated beyond anything he could have imagined. As he lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, his thoughts raced. What had he done? More importantly, who had he married? Rachel, the woman lying next to him in bed, seemed like an enigma, an unpredictable element that had thrown his life into chaos. Dylan turned his head slowly, watching her as she lay there, still asleep, her face serene. For a moment he studied her, the way her chest rose and fell gently with each breath, the way the sunlight caught her dark hair. There was a softness to her, something delicate, but there was also a hardness in her eyes. She wasn't like the women Dylan usually encountered. He couldn't quite place his finger on it, but there was something undeniably intriguing about her. His phone buzzed on the nightstand, snapping him out of his reverie. It was a message from Adam. Adam. "So, how's the new Mrs. Steele? Hope you're not regretting it yet. Don't worry, I'll make sure you get the yacht maintenance covered." Dylan let out a half-hearted chuckle. Adam, always the joker, but this wasn't a joke anymore. This was real, and Dylan had no idea what to do next. He had married a woman he barely knew, on a dare, and now they were stuck with each other. For how long? He didn't know. He glanced at Rachel again. She hadn't stirred, and for a moment Dylan debated whether to leave her to sleep or wake her up, but his curiosity got the better of him. He had to know more about her. After all, she was now his wife, even if only on paper, and that made her part of his life, however temporarily. "Rachel," Dylan said softly, his voice almost a whisper. She stirred, her eyes fluttering open. Her gaze met his, and for a moment there was an awkward silence between them. Neither of them seemed to know how to begin this strange new chapter. "Good morning," she said quietly, her voice still thick with sleep. "Morning," Dylan replied, sitting up slightly. "How are you feeling?" Rachel sat up too, stretching, her arms above her head. "I've had better mornings," she replied with a smirk, "but I'm fine. You?" "I'm not sure what I'm feeling," Dylan admitted, rubbing his temples. "This is a bit much to process, don't you think?" Rachel chuckled softly, the sound laced with a quiet bitterness. "A bit much? Try a whole lot of crazy." Dylan laughed, though it felt forced. "Yeah, I guess that's one way to put it." There was another long pause. Dylan wanted to ask her so many questions about who she was, what she did, how she ended up working at McDonald's, but he didn't know where to begin. This was all so sudden. Instead, he decided to take a different route. "What made you agree to this?" he asked, his curiosity bubbling to the surface. "I mean, you didn't have to say yes. You didn't even know me." Rachel's eyes flickered with something Dylan couldn't quite read. For a moment, she looked as if she were about to say something, but then she hesitated. "I don't know," she said finally, her voice low. "Maybe I was just tired of living my life the way it was. Maybe I wanted something different. I don't know." Dylan frowned. His curiosity piqued. There was something in her tone, something that hinted at a deeper story, something Rachel wasn't quite ready to share. It wasn't just the spontaneity of agreeing to marry him on a dare. It was something more. Before he could press further, there was a knock on the door. Dylan glanced at Rachel, who raised an eyebrow. "Who is it?" Dylan called out. "It's Adam," came the muffled reply. "I figured you two would still be sleeping, but I wanted to make sure the morning after wasn't too awkward." Dylan groaned, leaning back against the headboard. "I swear, if he brings up the dare again—" "Let him in," Rachel interrupted, a wry smile on her face. "I want to see this." Dylan reluctantly agreed, and Adam entered the room, a wide grin plastered on his face. He was clearly enjoying every second of the situation. "Well, well, well," Adam said, crossing his arms and eyeing the two of them. "You two look cozy. How's married life treating you?" Dylan rolled his eyes, but Rachel, to his surprise, didn't seem to mind Adam's teasing. In fact, she met his gaze with a playful glint in her eyes. "It's been interesting," she said. "What's next, Adam? You going to buy us a honeymoon package?" Adam chuckled. "Maybe later. But for now, I'm just here to make sure you two survive the rest of the day." Dylan shot Adam a look, but he couldn't help but feel a little lighter. Despite the absurdity of the situation, there was something about Rachel's calmness, her ability to handle the strange circumstances with humor that eased the tension in the room. "So, now what?" Dylan asked. "What happens now?" Rachel looked at him for a long moment before answering. "I don't know. We could go our separate ways, or we could see where this strange journey takes us. You're the millionaire after all. You've got all the answers, right?" Dylan laughed, though it wasn't a full laugh. It was more of a resigned chuckle. "I don't have any answers right now, but maybe we could spend the day together, get to know each other." Rachel tilted her head, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Why would I want to do that?" Dylan shrugged. "I don't know. Maybe because we're married now, and it seems like the thing to do." Rachel thought for a moment, then nodded. "All right. But don't expect me to spill my life story just yet." "Fair enough," Dylan agreed, relieved that she hadn't completely shut him out. As the day unfolded, Dylan and Rachel spent more time together. They went for a walk through the town, grabbed a simple lunch at a local cafe, and talked. But each conversation, each glance, left Dylan with more questions than answers. Who was this woman? What was her life like before this moment? And why had she agreed to marry him? The day ended with no clear resolution. Rachel remained a mystery, one Dylan wasn't sure he wanted to solve, or one he was afraid to uncover. But as they parted ways that evening, Dylan couldn't shake the feeling that he had just opened a door to a world far more complicated than he could have ever imagined. The days following Dylan's impulsive marriage to Rachel passed in a blur. What had started as a joke, a dare, had evolved into something that neither of them fully understood. Dylan, in particular, found himself caught between his desire to leave the situation behind and an overwhelming curiosity to get to know Rachel better. But each time he thought he might be ready to walk away, something in her eyes, a moment of vulnerability he glimpsed beneath her tough exterior, pulled him back. It had been a week since the wedding, and still, the strange marriage lingered, like a shadow over Dylan's perfectly controlled world. They hadn't shared a bed since that first night, and while they spent time together, it was always with a distance between them. Dylan knew he could simply walk away from the arrangement. Legally, it wasn't binding, but something inside him refused to leave it all behind. He was tired of the polished life he'd built, tired of the surface-level relationships he'd always kept. Rachel, though she had an air of mystery surrounding her, was real in a way that no one in his high society circle could ever be. There was something raw and genuine about her that intrigued him, but he couldn't quite figure out what it was. One evening, Dylan sat in his luxurious apartment overlooking the city. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, and the lights of the buildings twinkled in the distance. A glass of wine sat untouched in front of him, the crimson liquid swirling lazily in the glass. He hadn't been able to focus on work or his usual routine. His thoughts kept returning to Rachel. What had she done before this? Why had she agreed to this dare? It wasn't until a knock on the door broke him from his thoughts that he finally moved. Standing up, he walked toward the door with a sense of dread settling in his stomach. He wasn't expecting anyone, except maybe Adam, who was always popping in uninvited, but he opened the door anyway. To his surprise, it wasn't Adam standing there, it was Rachel. Her eyes were red, as if she'd been crying, and her posture seemed unusually stiff, as if she were holding something back. Dylan stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to say or do. For a second, he was taken aback by her appearance. She didn't look like the woman who had laughed off the ridiculousness of their marriage a week ago. There was a weight to her. That wasn't there before. "Rachel," he asked, his voice low with uncertainty, "is everything okay?" Rachel didn't answer immediately. She just stood there, looking past him into the apartment, as though she was trying to gather the courage to speak. Finally, she looked up at him. Her eyes filled with something he couldn't quite place. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice trembling. "But I need you to hear me out before you say anything." Dylan stepped aside, motioning for her to come in. "Of course, whatever it is, you can tell me." She walked past him into the living room, and he followed, closing the door behind them. Rachel sat down on the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Dylan sat opposite her, watching her closely. He had a feeling this conversation wasn't going to be easy. "I'm not who you think I am," Rachel began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't just marry you on a whim because of a dare. There's more to it than that." Dylan's stomach dropped. He wasn't sure why, but the way she said those words made his heart race. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice thick with confusion. "What else is there? You said you wanted something different. That was why you agreed to marry me." Rachel nodded slowly, but there was a sadness in her eyes now that Dylan hadn't seen before. "That's true. But the truth is, I didn't just want something different. I wanted to get away, to escape." Dylan leaned forward slightly. "Escape? From what?" Rachel closed her eyes, as if summoning the courage to speak. When she opened them again, Dylan saw the pain in her expression, pain that seemed to stretch back much further than the past week. "My life wasn't always like this," Rachel said, her voice tight. "I grew up in a small town, much like this one, but my family, we weren't wealthy. We struggled, but that wasn't the worst of it. The worst was what I had to endure because of who I was." Dylan frowned. "Who you were?" Rachel nodded. "I was different. My father, he was a drunk. My mother, well, She was barely there. I was left to fend for myself, which wasn't easy. But the worst part was the people I met, the men I got involved with. Dylan's heart began to race. He didn't know where this was headed, but he felt an unsettling knot form in his chest. "What do you mean by that?" Rachel took a deep breath, her eyes flickering to the floor. "I was looking for something, someone to love me, but I ended up with men who hurt me. I got involved with a man who promised me everything, but he used me. He got me hooked on drugs. He was abusive, and when I finally tried to get away, he found me." Dylan's stomach twisted, and he stood up, pacing across the room. This was far worse than he had imagined. He had thought Rachel was just a woman who had gone along with a dare. But now he understood. There was a darkness in her past, one that was still haunting her. "I didn't know," he said softly, his voice full of regret. "I had no idea." Rachel shook her head. "No one ever does. I've kept it hidden for so long. I didn't want to tell you, but I couldn't keep pretending. I had to tell you the truth." Dylan stopped pacing and turned to face her. He was at a loss for words. His mind raced as he tried to process what she was saying. The woman he had married, this mystery woman, had been through things that Dylan could barely even fathom. "You don't have to explain anything to me," he said, his voice gentle. "You don't owe me any answers. You've been through more than anyone should ever have to go through." Rachel looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. "You don't hate me?" Dylan shook his head. "Hate you? No, I could never hate you." Rachel seemed to relax slightly, though the tension in her shoulders remained. "I'm not looking for sympathy," she said, her voice steadier now. I need to get away from it all. That's why I agreed to marry you. I thought maybe I could start over, have a clean slate, but now I'm not sure if it was the right decision." Dylan's heart went out to her. He had never imagined that this quiet, strong woman had endured such a painful past. "Rachel," Dylan said, his voice firm, "you don't have to go through this alone. If you need help, if you want to escape, I'll help you. You don't have to keep running." Tears welled in her eyes, and for the first time since he'd met her, Dylan saw the full weight of her vulnerability. "I don't know how to stop running," she whispered. "It's all I've ever known." Dylan sat down beside her, his hand gently resting on hers. "Then let me help you learn to stop running. You're not alone anymore." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken words. But Dylan felt a sense of understanding pass between them. This wasn't just a marriage of convenience anymore. This was something deeper, a bond that was being forged in the fires of their shared struggles. Rachel finally spoke, her voice trembling. "I don't know what's going to happen next, but I need to figure it out, and I don't know if I'm ready to do that with you. But I'll try. I'll try if you'll let me." Dylan nodded slowly. "We'll figure it out. Together." As the night stretched on, they sat together, their lives intertwined in a way neither of them could have predicted. But one thing was certain: the journey ahead would be filled with challenges, and neither of them would ever be the same again. The days that followed Rachel's revelation were a blur for Dylan. His life, which had once seemed so perfectly structured, had become unpredictable and filled with questions. The woman who had appeared in his life as nothing more than a challenge had turned out to be someone far more complex, a survivor. And that complexity was something Dylan found himself drawn to, even if he didn't fully understand it. Rachel, for her part, had remained distant at times, retreating inward as if trying to shield herself from the raw emotions she had shared. But at other times, there were moments, fleeting glances, quiet conversations that gave Dylan a glimpse into the woman she truly was. She was tough, yes, but underneath that tough exterior, there was a vulnerability that made Dylan want to protect her, to shield her from the pain of her past. Dylan knew that he couldn't fix her past. No one could, But he also knew that he didn't want to walk away. Not now, not when he felt a connection, however unexpected, growing between them. One evening, as the sky began to darken and the first stars began to shimmer overhead, Dylan found himself sitting alone on the balcony of his apartment, staring out at the city. The lights below flickered like stars in the distance, and for a brief moment he allowed himself to think about the life he had once known, the life of wealth, privilege, and predictability. It seemed so far away now. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. "Dylan?" Rachel's voice floated through the apartment door. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" Dylan stood up and walked over, his heart racing. He had a feeling that tonight would be different. Rachel had been quieter than usual, and he sensed that she was on the verge of saying something important. When he opened the door, Rachel was standing there, her posture tense, her expression unreadable. Dylan stepped aside to let her in, and she walked past him without a word. He followed her into the living room, his curiosity piqued. Rachel sat down on the couch, but there was a nervous energy about her, as though she had something important to say, but wasn't sure how to begin. Dylan sat down beside her, his eyes locked on hers, waiting for her to speak. "I need to tell you something else," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Dylan's heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" he asked, his tone softer now. Sensing the weight of her words, Rachel's eyes flickered to the floor, and for a moment Dylan thought she might not say anything at all. But then she spoke, her voice steady but tinged with the pain of her confession. "I'm not running just from my past," she began. "I'm running from something else, someone." Dylan frowned, his thoughts immediately turning to the man Rachel had mentioned before, the one who had hurt her, the one who had gotten her hooked on drugs and caused her so much pain. He had assumed that the worst of it was behind her, that Rachel had escaped that world. But now it seemed there was more to the story. "Who is it?" Dylan asked, his voice filled with concern. "Who's after you, Rachel?" She hesitated, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "His name is Greg. He's the one who made my life a living hell. I thought I'd gotten away from him, but I was wrong." Dylan's heart sank. He had known there was more to Rachel's past than she had shared, but this was different. "What do you mean? Is he here? Is he dangerous?" Rachel shook her head, her face pale. "I don't know, but I've seen him around. He's been showing up in places I never expected. I don't know how he found me, but he did. I thought that if I married you, if I could get away from him, I'd be safe. But now I don't know. I'm scared, Dylan. I don't know what he'll do." The fear in her voice was unmistakable. Dylan felt a surge of protectiveness flood through him, and he placed a hand gently on hers, trying to offer her some comfort. "You don't have to be scared. You're not alone anymore, Rachel. I won't let him hurt you." Rachel looked up at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. "You don't understand, Dylan. This isn't just some ex-boyfriend who's trying to win me back. Greg is dangerous. He's the kind of man who doesn't let go, not without making people suffer." Dylan's jaw clenched, his mind racing. He didn't know the full extent of the danger Rachel was in, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let her face it alone. He had already made the decision when he had married her. He wasn't going to walk away from her now. "Where is he now?" Dylan asked, his voice low and determined. "Do you know where he is?" Rachel shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "I don't know, but he's been showing up at places I go, at the cafe I used to work at the grocery store. He's been following me, Dylan, and I don't know how much longer I can keep running." Dylan took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of emotions swirling inside him. "We'll figure this out. I'll help you. We'll go to the authorities, if we have to, but I won't let him hurt you." Rachel shook her head, her voice trembling. "I can't go to the authorities. He'll find a way to get to me. He's too powerful. He's connected, Dylan. You don't know what he's capable of." Dylan's mind spun, but he refused to let fear take over. Then we'll go somewhere else. We'll leave. We'll start over somewhere new. I'll make sure you're safe, Rachel, I promise. Rachel looked at him, her eyes searching his face as though trying to determine if he was serious. You would do that? You would leave everything behind for me? Dylan nodded, his expression unwavering. I already have. I married you, didn't I? And I'm not going to let you go through this alone. For the first time in days, Rachel's face softened. She blinked back tears, her chest rising and falling with the effort to calm herself. I don't know how to thank you for that. You don't have to thank me, Dylan replied, his voice steady. I made a promise to you, and I'm going to keep it. We'll get through this together. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of the situation hung between them, but there was also a sense of solidarity, of something unspoken that had been growing between them. The bond they shared, forged out of unexpected circumstances, was beginning to feel real. But as Dylan sat there holding Rachel's hand, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. There was still so much he didn't know about Rachel's past and the dangers that still lingered. Greg's shadow loomed large, and Dylan had a sinking feeling that the worst was yet to come. The days following Rachel's confession were a blur of urgency and hidden fears. Dylan tried his best to reassure her, to make her feel safe, but deep down he knew that the threat she was facing was real. Greg, the man who had tormented Rachel, had somehow tracked her down, and Dylan knew that it was only a matter of time. Before the situation escalated, the unease that had settled in the pit of his stomach never quite went away. Despite the fear that gripped him, Dylan refused to let Rachel face this alone. He arranged for extra security at his apartment, kept her close, and began to take precautions. Every time they went out, he found himself looking over his shoulder, checking the faces around them, wondering if Greg was watching from the shadows. Rachel, though, remained distant. She had shared the truth about her past, but the weight of it seemed to pull her further away. She became withdrawn, as though she were afraid of getting too close to Dylan, afraid that he might see her as damaged. The connection they had begun to form felt fragile, like a delicate thread that might snap at any moment. Dylan, however, wasn't ready to give up. Not now. Not when he had come to care for Rachel in a way he had never expected. She had shown him a side of life he had never known, a side that was real and raw, far removed from the world of wealth and privilege he had always inhabited. She had opened his eyes to the complexities of the human spirit, the resilience, the survival, the will to push forward despite unimaginable pain. One evening, as the sun set behind the city skyline, Dylan sat at his desk, sifting through paperwork. He tried to focus on the task at hand, but his thoughts kept drifting back to Rachel. He couldn't help it. She had become the center of his world, even though he knew he didn't fully understand her. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door. Dylan's heart raced. He had been expecting a call from the private investigator he had hired to find Greg, but he hadn't expected someone to show up in person. He stood up, crossing the room to open the door, and found Rachel standing in the hallway. She looked different. Her eyes were red, and her expression was one of quiet determination. She was no longer the fragile woman she had been the first time they met. There was strength in her now, a quiet resolve that made her seem almost unrecognizable. "Rachel?" Dylan asked, his voice filled with concern. "What's going on?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stepped into the apartment, closing the door behind her. Her eyes were filled with an emotion Dylan couldn't quite place. Fear. Yes, but there was something else too, something that made his chest tighten. "Dylan," Rachel said, her voice steady, but laced with urgency. "I think he's found me." Dylan felt his stomach drop. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. "What do you mean? Where is he? Do you know where he is?" Rachel nodded slowly. I don't know exactly, but I saw him today. I saw him at the cafe I used to work at. I thought I was being paranoid, but I saw him. I know it was him. Dylan's mind raced. He had been expecting this, but hearing Rachel's words made it all too real. "We need to call the police," he said, his voice firm. "We'll go. To them. We'll get a restraining order. Rachel shook her head, cutting him off. "No, Dylan, you don't understand. If I go to the police, he'll just find a way to retaliate. He's always had people. He's dangerous, and I can't risk him coming after you, or anyone else. Not like this." Dylan's heart raced as the gravity of her words sank in. He had known that Greg was a threat, but hearing Rachel's fear, seeing it in her eyes, made the danger feel tangible. "What do you want me to do?" Dylan asked, his voice low. "How can I help?" Rachel took a deep breath, and for a moment Dylan could see the weight of her decision bearing down on her. She didn't want to put him in danger. He could tell. But she had no choice. "I think I need to leave," Rachel said quietly. "I think it's the only way. I need to disappear. I need to get away from all of this. From him." Dylan's heart clenched in his chest. The thought of Rachel leaving, of losing her, was unbearable. He had come to care for her in a way he hadn't thought possible. She wasn't just some woman he married on a dare anymore. She was a part of his life, a part of him. "I won't let you go," Dylan said, his voice shaking with emotion. "I won't let you face this alone. If you leave, I'm coming with you. We'll figure this out together. I'll protect you. I swear I will." Rachel's eyes flickered with a mix of relief and sadness. "Dylan, I don't want to drag you into this. I don't want you to get hurt. You've done enough for me already. You've given me a chance when no one else would." Dylan reached out and took her hand in his grip firm. "I'm not backing down. Not now. I made a promise to you when I married you. I'm not letting you go through this alone." Rachel's lips trembled, and for a moment it seemed like she might say something more, but she remained silent. She squeezed his hand, and Dylan could see the tears threatening to fall from her eyes. "I don't know if I can keep running forever," she whispered. "I'm tired, Dylan. I just want peace. I want to feel safe." Dylan didn't know how to promise her that safety, but he would try. He had to. "We'll make sure you're safe. We'll leave. We'll go somewhere no one can find us. We'll start over, Rachel. I'll take you anywhere you want to go. You're not alone anymore." The weight of the situation hung between them, but as they stood there, hands intertwined, Dylan felt a surge of hope. It wasn't much, but it was something. They had each other, and for now, that had to be enough. Later that night, Dylan couldn't sleep. His mind was racing, planning the next steps, trying to figure out how they could get away from Greg. But as the hours passed, a creeping sense of dread began to settle in. They couldn't run forever. At some point, Rachel would have to confront the past she was running from, and Dylan couldn't help but wonder if there would ever be an end to this dangerous game they were playing. The next morning, Dylan and Rachel packed their bags. It wasn't a decision they made lightly, but it was the only option they had left. They couldn't stay in the city, not with Greg out there somewhere, watching, waiting. Dylan arranged for a private jet to take them to a secluded location, somewhere far from the reach of the people who might be looking for them. He didn't tell anyone where they were going, not even Adam, who'd been checking in on them periodically. He knew it would be safer if they kept their departure under wraps. As they boarded the jet, Rachel looked at Dylan, her expression a mix of uncertainty and gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." Dylan smiled softly, his eyes filled with resolve. "We're in this together. You're not alone anymore, and I'm not going anywhere." The jet lifted off into the sky, and as they flew away from the life they had known, Dylan couldn't help but feel a strange sense of calm wash over him. They were leaving the danger behind, for now. But the road ahead was uncertain. What they Faced wasn't just the threat of Greg, it was Rachel's past, and as long as that past remained unresolved, there would always be a shadow hanging over them. But Dylan wasn't afraid. Not anymore. He had made a promise, and he intended to keep it. The days turned into weeks as Dylan and Rachel settled into their new, isolated life. The remote cabin they had moved into sat nestled in the mountains, far away from the chaos and danger of the city. Surrounded by dense forests and quiet streams, it seemed like the perfect place to hide, a sanctuary from the ghosts of Rachel's past. But even in the quiet, Dylan knew that their escape wouldn't last forever. Rachel's past wasn't something that could be outrun. It would eventually catch up to them. For the first time in what felt like forever, Rachel seemed to relax. The weight of her past, the constant fear that had haunted her every step, began to lift as she found a sense of peace in their new life. She spent her days tending to the garden outside their cabin, and Dylan found himself starting to enjoy the simplicity of their routine. There were no more glamorous parties, no more deadlines or board meetings, just the two of them, finding solace in the quiet moments. But even as Rachel began to heal, Dylan could sense that something was still unresolved. He knew that deep down, Rachel was still running, still carrying the heavy burden of her past. And though she had come a long way, he could see the toll it had taken on her. The fear in her eyes had softened, but it had never fully disappeared. It was as though the specter of Greg, her abuser, was still looming over them, even though they were miles away from the life she had once known. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountain peaks, casting a golden hue over the landscape, Rachel sat outside on the porch, staring out into the distance. Dylan had noticed that she'd been unusually quiet that day, her usual energy subdued. He walked over to her, taking a seat beside her on the wooden bench. "Hey," he said softly, his voice breaking the silence. "You've been quiet all day. What's going on in that head of yours?" Rachel didn't answer right away. She just stared out at the horizon, her face unreadable. Dylan watched her, waiting. He had learned over the past few weeks that patience was one of the keys to understanding Rachel. She needed time to process, time to open up. Finally she spoke, her voice low and hesitant. "I keep thinking about the past, Dylan, about Greg. I thought that by running away, by starting over, I could finally escape him. But I'm starting to wonder if it's really that easy. What if he's still looking for me? What if I can never truly be free?" Dylan's heart tightened as he listened to her words. He had known that Rachel wasn't entirely free from her past, but hearing her voice, the fear and uncertainty that still plagued her broke something inside him. "You don't have to do this alone," he said, his voice firm, full of conviction. "You've come so far already, Rachel. You're not the same person you were when I met you. You're stronger than you think." Rachel turned to look at him, her eyes filled with sadness. "I'm not sure I believe that anymore. What if the past really is a part of who I am? What if it defines me forever?" Dylan reached out, placing his hand on hers. "The past doesn't define you, Rachel. It's what you do with the past that matters. You've made it this far. You've survived things that would break most people. And you're here now, with me. We're in this together." Rachel squeezed his hand, her gaze softening. But there was still a flicker of doubt in her eyes. "I don't know if I can outrun it forever. What if he comes looking for me again?" Dylan didn't have an easy answer for her. The reality of their situation was harsh. Rachel couldn't hide forever. Greg was a dangerous man, and Dylan knew that sooner or later they would have to confront him. They couldn't stay in hiding forever. But that didn't mean they had to do it alone. "We'll face it when it comes," Dylan said, his voice calm. "But we don't have to face it today. Today, we're here, together. And that's all that matters right now." Rachel nodded, though her expression remained clouded with uncertainty. Dylan understood. There was no quick fix, no simple solution. Rachel had been running for so long, and the thought of confronting her past was terrifying. But he also knew that running forever wasn't the answer. That night, as they sat in silence, the crackling fire in the hearth casting flickering shadows on the walls, Dylan made a decision. He would take the next step, no matter how difficult it might be. He wasn't going to let Rachel face her past alone. Not when she had come to mean so much to him. The next morning, Dylan made a call to the private investigator he had hired. Weeks earlier, the one who had been tracking Greg's movements. The news was both good and bad. Greg had disappeared from the radar. No one knew where he had gone, and it seemed like he had vanished for good. But that didn't mean he was gone forever. The investigator had warned Dylan that Greg was a shadow, a man who could blend in, disappear, and reappear when least expected. Dylan hung up the phone and looked at Rachel. She was sitting at the kitchen table, her face tense as she read through a book she'd borrowed from a nearby town. She looked up as he entered, her eyes searching his face for answers. "We need to talk," Dylan said softly, his voice steady. Rachel put the book down, her expression apprehensive. "About what?" "About Greg," Dylan said, taking a deep breath. "The investigator said he's gone for now, but that doesn't mean he's gone forever. We need to make a decision. We can keep running, or we can face him. I'm not asking you to do this alone, Rachel. Whatever you decide, I'm with you." Rachel's face softened, and for a moment, Dylan saw a flicker of relief in her eyes. It was as if the weight of the decision had finally been taken off her shoulders. She didn't have to make this choice alone. "I don't want to run anymore," Rachel said quietly, her voice steady. "I can't keep running. It's time to face it. Face him." Dylan nodded, his heart swelling with pride for the woman who had come so far. "Then we'll face him together." Over the next few days they began to prepare for the inevitable confrontation. Dylan made arrangements to meet with the authorities, to gather any evidence they had on Greg, and to ensure that Rachel would be protected. They weren't going to let this man dictate their lives anymore. They were going to take control. When the day finally came for them to confront Greg, it was clear that this was a turning point for both of them. The fear was still there, lurking in the back of Rachel's mind, but there was something else too. Strength. She was no longer the scared woman who had fled from her past. She was a survivor, ready to face whatever came next. Dylan held Rachel's hand as they walked into the room where they would meet the authorities, their steps steady and sure. Together they had faced the past, and they were ready to move forward into a future they would build on their own terms. The authorities had already tracked down Greg's whereabouts, and when the door to the small conference room opened, Dylan could see the man who had tormented Rachel for so long sitting across the table. He was older now, harder, but the same cold eyes met Rachel's, and for a moment time seemed to stand still. Rachel stood tall, her voice unwavering as she spoke to him. "You don't control me anymore, Greg. I'm done. And you'll never hurt me again." Dylan stood beside her, his presence a silent promise of protection. This was the moment when Rachel took back her life. The past had come to a head, and now it was time for her to reclaim the future she deserved. The confrontation was intense, but it marked the beginning of Rachel's healing process. The authorities, armed with evidence and the support of Rachel's testimony, ensured that Greg would no longer be a threat. The shadow that had haunted Rachel for so long was finally gone, and though the scars would always remain, Rachel was free. As they left the building, Dylan took Rachel's hand in his, a quiet promise in his grip. They had faced the past together, and now they could move forward. Whatever came next, they would face it as a team together. The journey had been long, but it had led them to this moment. And for the first time in years, Rachel felt the weight of her past begin to lift. There was hope now, hope for a future she had never believed possible. Dylan and Rachel walked into their new life side by side, ready to build something that was truly theirs. The end.